Hi guys, Michael Fights with Friends here, and I'm really happy to be doing another one of these State of the UFC addresses. This was very popular last time. I think it went over very well with people that maybe a lot of the facts that are out there with the UFC, you have to do a little more digging for them. So I'm happy to be doing another one. I'm doing it because I seen Dana White go on Tony Robbins over the weekend. As you might have seen, I was streaming it for a while. I was streaming it throughout the entire thing, and then for some reason, Tony Robbins decided to interrupt my stream, even though it wasn't copyrighted or anything yet, and he didn't have it on YouTube yet. Anyways, that's okay. I'm not in trouble for it. I was just upset that you guys didn't get to see the rest of it. But I gotta say, I was very critical of Dana White in the last UFC address, and I think for good reason. I was very upset at some of the things with the way he talked about some of the fighters. You guys know I'm beating this weigh-in thing down, and I'm going to continue to beat that door down until something changes, because I care about the safety and well-being, both physically and financially, of our fighters. I want to see them get a fair shake. But I got to admit, watching Dana White come on Tony Robbins and seeing Tony Robbins, the inspirational speaker, announce him, see that crowd getting excited, seeing Dana White going through and telling his life story. Again, some of these things that I hadn't heard for a long time, some of them were kind of new to me. Or maybe they were just phrased a little differently, though. It was very inspirational, and I have to tell you, if you're an NFL fan, generally you're not a big fan of the commissioner. You don't want to listen to what he has to say. Same thing with the NBA, Major League Baseball. That's not somebody you care about. You don't trust anything they say. They come off very inauthentic. All their speeches are pre-written by a lawyer. You guys know the deal. When Dana White comes out on Tony Robbins and everybody's cheering for him and everybody's excited to see him there, and he's talking about his story, and we think back, or at least I think back to before there was a UFC, or definitely before it was as successful as it is now. It's hard not to look at that moment and remember, hey, that's our guy right there. Without that guy, we would not be watching any of this. So I said, I have been very critical of Dana White in the past, and especially recently, but let me tell you, I respect the hell out of that guy for a lot of reasons. If you guys haven't seen his interview with Tony Robbins, absolutely phenomenal. This time, I'm going to link you to Tony Robbins' site. He's posted it on YouTube. That way he gets the views for it if you guys want to watch it again. It's just a little over an hour. I highly, highly recommend it. But some of the things he talked about is, of course, 500 plus athletes now in the UFC, 40 plus countries represented, 1.1 billion homes in the world have UFC pay-per-view available to them. 1.1 billion. That is absolutely incredible. I talked about our aging fans in the last State of the UFC address. They are still the youngest fans in all of sports. The median age of a UFC fan is 39.7. And I am 39.7, basically. I am the median age. But that's the lowest by far among other sports. And it was just great to watch Dana White come out, and you remember again why you like fighting. You remember, hey, when you were on the playground as a kid, and there was two kids after school, oh, so-and-so's really good at basketball. This guy's really good at basketball. Hey, they're going to be playing basketball out behind the red barn after school. Let's all go there and watch them. You know what? A few people might go there and watch these guys play basketball that are really into basketball. Probably not. Now, if Jimmy and Johnny are going to go fight behind the Red Barn after school, everybody wants to watch it, and everybody has an opinion. Jimmy's going to kick Johnny's butt. Johnny's going to mop the floor with Jimmy. You don't know what you're talking about. Now you're going back and forth between each other. You're breaking down fight styles of, middle school kids and why they're going to get this done. When Dana White says fighting is in our DNA, I mean, there's nothing truer on earth. Like you said, a guy who can throw a ball through a hoop. That's awesome. LeBron James is awesome. I have a huge amount of respect for him. That's great. But it's like you have a room where you say, this guy can throw a ball through a hoop. He's really good at it. And this is an international room. It's not, U.S. fans. Like the NFL is not big around the world. And so you have an international room. You say, hey, this guy's really good at throwing the pigskin to other guys and watching them catch the ball and run it in. Cool. That's awesome. Hey, see that guy over there? That guy's the heavyweight champion in the world, and he can kick everyone's ass in this room. Instantly, everyone is drawn to that guy. Whether it's been Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, all the way back to Floyd Patterson, throughout the years. George Foreman, we've been infatuated with that person. And then it became Tito Ortiz, it became Chuck Liddell, it became Anderson Silva, which morphed into John Jones. Now people are enamored with Conor McGregor, Daniel Cormier. The UFC, the product itself, is always a commodity that people are going to pay for. Like, people are going to eat. People are going to watch two people get into a cage and fight. And everyone has an opinion on it. They understand the rules very clearly. Oh, you can't poke people in the eyes. You can't kick them in the groin. You can't headbutt them. You can't kick them while they're down on the ground. Great. For the majority of it, that's pretty easy to understand. Sometimes we forget the success at the UFC, or at least I forget the success they've had since, 2005. Even since they went on The Ultimate Fighter back then. The Fertitta brothers were about to sell this thing. They were bleeding money. They had put $40 million into it. And they told Dana White, start shopping this thing. He starts doing some things. Says, how much can you get out of it? He's talking to Lorenzo. He says, I think I can get about $7 or $8 million. He says, okay, I'll call you back in the morning. So he calls him back in the morning. Lorenzo says, F it. F it. We're going balls to the wall with this thing. They end up doing the Spike contract. And, of course, the rest is history. They were ready to sell. Now, some facts I did not know because I assumed that these were boxing records. Highest grossing sporting events in arena history. The United States has it for Echo Arena, Pent Arena, Barclays Center, but they have the all-time highest grossing sporting event in the history of Madison Square Garden. That's the pinnacle. That's the pinnacle of the fight game. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. So many greats fought there. That is, besides the Roman Colosseum, that is probably the most famous fight venue in the entire world. For all the doom and gloom that my last State of the UFC address had, I'm actually very, very optimistic about the second half of the year for the UFC due to deals that have been done lately. Of course, Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov Conor McGregor has, I believe it's like 2 out of the 4 or maybe 3 out of the 4 largest pay-per-views ever, with him and Nate Diaz, I believe, being the biggest. I think people forget about Khabib's popularity when it comes to this, or that people just aren't realizing how popular he actually is. Now, the UFC in February of last year signed a new big deal with Russian broadcasting systems through a third party called Telecast. They were able to get them a lucrative multi-million-dollar deal, which is big in Russia, because, as you know, they have not even had a UFC in Russia yet. The first UFC in Russia will be on September 15th. So for never have even had a show there, they're doing very well. And Khabib Nurmagomedov is bringing in a lot of that interest. Now, there's a lot of interest in the United States when you see Khabib, when I'm watching PFL, and what I know from streaming. You guys are seeing it when you have Russian fighters, when you have Dagestani fighters, when you have Ukrainian fighters. You're seeing a lot of these guys in the stream. That is a hotbed, and that is starting to translate to cash. I'm going to call it right now. A lot of people think that Conor McGregor is, they're going to do good. They're like, okay, that's great. They sold the tickets. They sold out the event, the live tickets between Khabib and Conor McGregor in like 3 minutes. $2,500 tickets, a lot of them. And then they added an extra $1,000 on to be able to go to the UFC buffet, schmooze with some of the fighters, so $3,500 a pop. 3 minutes. So what a lot of people came out and said, and this is 100% true, the UFC has not had a hard time selling out live events for a long time. It just doesn't. There's so many of them. If you've been to a live event, especially if you've got a good seat where you're up closer, you know it's one of the greatest sporting events on earth. It's, you know, it's a great experience with the fans, the fighters, and everything. So that's not surprising. But I believe that Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor breaks every single record the UFC has ever had. I believe that it breaks every single pay-per-view record between Zuffa time, whatever time you're talking about. This, the over-under I would give you on this, if I'm a casino, is 2.5 million pay-per-view buys. Now, the UFC has never had a pay-per-view that's reached 2 million. I'm going to tell you right now, this pay-per-view is going to sell 2.5 million pay-per-view buys. I absolutely 100% guarantee it. If I am wrong, I will come on the show and admit that I am wrong. I don't believe that I am wrong. First, you have a built-up demand for Conor McGregor. He sold $4 million in a boxing match. Yes, he brung over a lot of new boxing people in that match. But he brung over a lot of fans in that. We're also starting to see some crossover between WWE fans and UFC fans. You might be saying, Mike, what in the hell are you talking about? What in the hell does that have to do with Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor? Those fans like drama. That's why they watch the WWE. They're going to continue to circle through the media. Conor McGregor throwing dollies through the windows, the attack on the bus, Khabib Nurmagomedov being undefeated, 25-26-0. You cannot underestimate the selling power of an undefeated, scary Russian in the United States. I know we're in 2018. I know this is not 1980. This is not the 1980 Hockey League. This is not, the Olympics. The Olympic wrestling team when Rulon Gardner took out the indestructible Russian. But this is like a real life Drago kind of character. Now, they have not villainized Khabib Nurmagomedov. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the UFC generally does not go out of their way to make someone something they're not. And, you know, they take pride in that, and I take pride in representing them in that. I like that. That's great. Conor is very bombastic, very arrogant, a showman. They allow him to embrace that. Khabib's a little more, you know, serious, quiet, silent assassin kind of guy, and they let him embrace that. But like I said, these Dagestani guys, they're going to get together and pay for these pay-per-views. The Russians, the Ukrainians, this is very much the reason that soccer is the #1 sport in the world is because it is mano a mano, country versus country. It has nothing to do with a little ball being kicked into a net. And it has everything to do with Mexico versus Spain, Brazil versus the Dominican Republic, Japan versus China. You look at the World Cup. That's the reason it's the most popular sport in the world. And nothing sells in fights like international beef. And that's what we have now between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor. Plus, you have the biggest star in the history of the UFC fighting the biggest Russian star in the history of the UFC. I don't know if people realize how many Russian Americans there are out there. How many Dagestani Americans there are out there, and how many fight fans there are out there. You guys don't know how many emails I get just recently on my MMA Mike Facebook, nationwide, but from Dagestan, from places all over the world, emailing me. How do I become an MMA fighter? How do I come to the United States to become an MMA fighter? Unfortunately, they misconstrue me to be a lot better source than I am, and I really don't have any path to help them with, except for, you know, to share their post and hope somebody that actually can help them sees it. Otherwise, you know, do like a lot of fighters do, get on a plane, go to AKA, knock on the door, and say, I'm willing to get beat up for the next 3 months for free. Yeah, that's the way into these camps and into MMA. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, that's just the way it is. But that is the biggest fight ever. Like I said, Conor McGregor. The next reason, let's go, is that the second half of 2018 is going to be absolutely stellar for the UFC, is UFC 230. And we're going to go into that in just a moment. So Dana White felt empowered enough in this interview with Tony Robbins to say that this ESPN deal, 5-year deal, $1.5 billion, took the evaluation in his mind of the UFC from $5 billion to $7 billion in one swoop. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. And like I said, this is going to be a big second half of the year. And a lot of this growth that you're seeing is not just the ESPN deal, but there's a lot of these international deals behind the scene. But UFC 230, let's talk about that for a minute. We got Nate Diaz, Dustin Poirier. What did I say from the very beginning when they were bringing back Conor? Those of you that were watching, we don't know what Nate Diaz's selling power is by itself. So they will have to have Conor come back first, see what happens, then look at putting Nate on a card. Well, they put their money where their mouth was, and they scheduled both fights back to back without finding out the results of those fights. Major props. I give them major props. I believe for the future of the sport and for the financial well-being of everyone involved, the best thing that can happen to Conor McGregor is that he loses. Nate Diaz wins. Conor McGregor loses. Now the pressure is off Conor McGregor to defend the championship. and he does not want that. He's never defended a championship in his life. In the organization he was in, an organization he was in before the UFC, he had belts in 2 different weight classes. I've talked about this before. He never defended either one of them. He's had belts in 2 weight classes in the UFC. He never defended either one of them. He may be interested in winning a 165-pound belt when they finally redo the weight classes. He is not interested in defending any belts whatsoever. After he lost the first fight to Nate, the second fight became bigger. If he loses to Khabib Nurmagomedov, especially if it's controversial or he has a good showing, he rocks Khabib several times, he gives people a reason to be excited. Then Nate Diaz goes out there, win or lose against Dustin Poirier. That doesn't really matter. And honestly, if Conor loses, it would probably be better for Nate's future for him to lose too, because then you're not talking about title implications. Then you have, Dustin Poirier and maybe Tony Ferguson are the only ones that are log jamming up this #1 contender spot at 155 to fight Khabib. And you could throw Kevin Lee in there, but in my mind, Tony's first, and then I would say Kevin Lee versus Dustin Poirier fights the winner of that. That's how I would do that. But what we all want to see at the end of the day, and they're going to play a lot of smoke and mirrors, as much as I've given them credit for being honest, let's all be honest and say the fight that they want to see, everybody wants to see, is Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor. Now, I talked about Nate Diaz not being able to sell fights by himself, or we don't know what the selling power of him is by himself. There's another great fighter who has a lot of interest, but has not shown huge selling potential by himself. And that is, of course, former light heavyweight champion Jon Jones. I believe when you have 2 fighters that have not fought in so long, if Jon Jones, as it is rumored that he may be the main event at UFC 230, fights on the same card as Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier, you have 1 million to 1.5 million sell pay-per-view. You have one of the top 10, if not higher, pay-per-views of all time. And you also have back-to-back multi-million sell pay-per-views heading into the ESPN deal. The UFC could not look any better. This thing could go a lot of ways good, very good for the UFC, as long as everybody's able to show up and everybody's able to fight well. Now, of course, Jon Jones, that's no guarantee. We don't know what's happening with him. We don't even know that he's going to be cleared to fight. But after this, we have UFC Russia. We have Darren Till and Tyron Woodley. Some people care about that, not as much as they would if it was Colby Covington and Tyron Woodley. For the UFC's sake, they better hope that Tyron Woodley comes out with that belt, or that Darren Till wins it and vacates it and goes up to 185, which I feel Darren Till should and will go up to 185 either way. He cannot safely make 170 pounds. But very, very good scenarios for the UFC. Very smart matchmaking. They have their stars back. If Jon Jones is legitimately back, you have everybody but Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey's not coming back anyways. You have Conor back. You have Nate back. You have possibly Jon Jones probably before the end of the year. You have Brock Lesnar most likely back and will probably fight before the end of the year. Let's talk about that. That's probably going to end up being in December. Then you have Nick saying he wants to fight starting the beginning of next year, depending on what goes on with these legal proceedings. The UFC's going from, a land of no stars to a sky filled with stars very quickly. Very, very quickly. And I don't know how many fights Conor's got left. They're going to have to look for a replacement for him, obviously. But Dana talked about a star in China coming on, and you guys are going to hear more about him, and I'm going to leave it at that. But he said if this guy, he believes, has potential to be a world champion, if this guy out of China becomes a world champion, all bets are off. This thing's going to explode. And he's absolutely right. They were able to secure a multi-million-dollar television deal in Russia. You can do just about anything, and China would be right for the pickings, even with ONE FC there. ONE FC is doing great, but there's a lot of people there, and everybody realizes that the UFC is the major leagues of MMA. So I want to know what you guys think. What is the UFC looking like going into the second half of 2018, 2019? Last State of the UFC address, I brought you a lot of doom and gloom. This was before Conor came back, before there was talks of John Jones coming back, before Nate Diaz was signed to a contract, before a lot of things. I still think that the UFC eventually is going away from the pay-per-view model. Maybe 1 or 2 pay-per-views a year. But when you give people free fights, you're going to take your money from ESPN. But the way they're growing globally, like I said, they are available in 1.1 billion households now. Billion. The number's gonna grow. We're gonna get more popular, and man, do we have some awesome streams coming up that we're gonna have some fun with on Fights with Friends. Let me know what you guys think about all this down there in the comments. What fights are you most looking forward to that have been scheduled? What fights at the end of 2018 do you most want to see scheduled? And for even on for 2019, and what status do you think the UFC is in? Do you think that the UFC has gotten more valuable since WME took over, or less valuable? There's a lot of arguments to both sides. And if you go back and watch my last State of the UFC address, you're going to see a lot of the negatives. This one, I brought out a lot of the positives. I kind of brung it along a little full circle. If you watch maybe both of them together, I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, but any way you look at it, the UFC should have a great second half of 2018. Let me know what you think down there in the comments. Thank you so much for viewing. As always, I love you, I respect you, and I'll see your fine asses later.